how long has parental alienation been going on? When I grew up, I don't remember families being divorced. And my parents were divorced. I think I was the only family that I knew for a long time. I've talked with some other people about this, and maybe it dates me as far as age-wise, but people said, yeah, you know what? There was only the divorced families you knew. Mm-hmm. There was something that was different about that family. Mm-hmm. Today, the intact family is the one that's almost like, oh, they're still married. Mm-hmm. They're on their first marriage. There's been a whole different change in the marriage commitment, the dynamic in society. Was parental alienation going on back in the 60s, or is this something that's happened more over the last 20, 30 years from your perspective?
Well, definitely, I think that when we talked earlier about the unhealthy parent-child alignments that mm-hmm. can occur in intact families, that before the divorce rate began to really climb mm-hmm. steadily, which is in the late 60s and 70s.
Right.
What you probably would have seen were alienation strategies within the intact family causing preferential alignments between children and their parents.
Yeah.
Maybe not healthy, but still not to the complete refusal right. that we see in alienation now. So definitely, as parents began to, as the divorce rate went up and parents began to separate their households, we began to see more and more of it. Richard Gardner came out with the 8 signs of alienation in 85. Mm-hmm. 1985, but there were writings on alienation and disrupted parent-child relationships and refusal to see parents and undermining and manipulating parents' relationships with their with another parent long before that. But for me, and it's different for every professional really, depending on how much you've read of the literature, for me the writing on parental alienation exponentially increased, and our knowledge of it increased in the 80s.
You mentioned at the seminar that in the DSM-5, child psychological abuse in yes. 2013, mm-hmm. that was put in there in 2013. Can you give a little bit, I didn't know that was in there at that time, and can you give a little bit more background on that?
So what I know about that is is a part of the discussions that were going on about including parental alienation in the 5th edition of the DSM.
Okay.
Where there were discussions about having it included as a disorder. And through those discussions, it became clear that some of the things everyone could agree on is that there was a manipulation of the child's perceptions mm-hmm. that was harmful to the child. Mm-hmm. And so, although parental alienation disorder did not get included in the 5th edition, mm-hmm. Child psychological abuse did,
okay.
Which now allows practitioners like myself who do parental alienation assessments to be able to say, according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, this child meets the criteria for child psychological abuse. And in order to have an argument to change custody, being able to show that the child is being psychologically harmed is a key element to that argument. Mm-hmm. So it has been extremely helpful.
So when you look at the psychological abuse versus, we'll say, physical abuse, if you see a child who has marks of physical abuse, what is your responsibility to the authorities?
To report to okay. Child Protective Services.
What about in a situation with child psychological abuse? Do you have any responsibilities to report to anybody with that?
As a professional, I believe that I do. Mm-hmm. Child Protective Service is less likely to investigate a report of psychological abuse.
Even though the damage
Alienation.
may be even deeper.
That's correct.
So Children's Protective Services, if you mention something like child psychological abuse, there may be just, we're not going to pay any attention to this.
I don't know what it's, I mean, I can't say what they do with that.
Yeah.
I can tell you that the reaction that I get is emotional and psychological abuse. It's very hard to prove. I don't know that the investigations actually take place.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. I mentioned, and Dr. Childress, of course, but when he was testifying in Pennsylvania before a committee up there, he talked about the 3 fingerprints that were unmistakably indicated child psychological abuse. And he said, these 3 fingerprints are evident, and this is the only symptom that they describe. This is the only thing that they describe. When you were giving your presentation today, I kept on going back to that, because some of the things you were talking about were the same things that he was talking about. This is child psychological abuse. This is child psychological abuse. Child psychological abuse. And it just seems too frequently that we ignore that, the real long-term impact on the children that can have by psychologically abusing them.
Yes. It also makes it difficult on Child Protective Service professionals when they do go to interview the child, and what the child says is, if it's an alienated child, they have plenty of stories of why they are rejecting their other parent.
Yeah.
And the focus has always been on what's the child saying. What do they say? They say they don't want to see that parent. They say that they don't want to go over there because the parent yells at them, or the parent left them alone, or even the child will say the parent hit me. And so for Child Protective Services, it's like the child they're protecting is telling them that parent. However, the fact that the child's been psychologically manipulated to say those things, right?
Yeah.
is another level of investigation that I think we might be asking them too much of them to go to that level of investigation to figure out that the child had been manipulated to make those allegations against the other parent, right?
So do you have a lot of confidence or faith in CPS workers? What I've seen is that there's not a lot of educational requirements to a lot of the caseworkers. I know that there are some very good people that have been involved with CPS, but there have been, I think, legitimate complaints about inadequate training, about people who make decisions who really don't know what they're doing. I had a friend, Rod McCall, I don't know if you're familiar with his story, but situation of severe alienation with his ex-wife, got Children's Protective Services to believe every single bad thing about Rod, even though he had done none of this stuff. And he eventually went back they had a full jury trial, and they awarded him his son, but they let her go back to say goodbye to the son first. She went home, shot the son, killed him, killed herself. And it was a horrific thing.
That is a horrific thing. That is, though, a good example of a couple of things. One, why when we recommend a transition or a transfer of residence or a custody change in a hearing and provide evidence for severe parental alienation, the child leaves from the courthouse with the parent, with the newly appointed parent.
Right.
Because contact with the alienating parent could be detrimental to the extent that you just described.
Yeah.
The other piece of what you talk about is the extent that professionals must go to prove that the child's voice is not their own, to prove that what the child is alleging is not true.
Yeah.
And that it takes a full-blown hearing of days of evidence to often show that all that the child is saying is the words of a mentally ill parent. And which is why CPS doesn't have the wherewithal to look into that to the extent that they need to, or that we as professionals need to show that alienation is occurring. So I think I hit on several things there.
You did. Let me ask the same question about CPS as I did about the attorneys. CPS, friend or foe of the family?
The answer's the same. It depends.
It depends.
It depends on the training.
Yeah.